The moment is still clear in my mind. We were at Daniel and Priya's house. 8 people around a dinner table, good food, open wine. The kind of night where conversation flows easy and everyone's a little more relaxed than usual. I was telling a story about a project I'd been leading at work for almost a year, something I was genuinely proud of. The kind of thing you don't get to talk about often because it takes so long to have something real to show for it. I was about halfway through, not rambling, not dominating the table, just talking. And that's when I saw it. My wife, Claire, sitting 2 seats down from me, turned her head slightly to the side and rolled her eyes. Not a small flicker, a full, slow, deliberate roll, like she'd heard this story 100 times and couldn't believe I was boring these people with it. Like I was embarrassing her just by speaking. Priya saw it. I know she did because she looked down at her plate immediately. Daniel kept his eyes on me, expression careful, the way people look when they're trying to pretend something didn't just happen. I kept talking. I finished the story. I even smiled at the end. But something shifted in me in that moment, and it didn't shift back. That's what this story is about. Not the eye roll by itself. Eye rolls happen in marriages. People get impatient. People have bad nights. I know that. But this wasn't a bad night. This was a pattern that had been building for 2 years, and that moment at Priya's dinner table was the night it finally had a face I couldn't ignore. What I didn't do that night is what changed everything. I didn't call her out. I didn't go cold. I didn't start an argument on the drive home. I just went quiet in a way I hadn't been before. Not the quiet of someone hurt and sulking, the quiet of someone who had finally made a decision. And here's the part that still surprises me when I think back on it. She didn't notice for almost 2 weeks.
She had no idea that the version of me who used to explain himself, defend himself, chase her approval, try to make her understand, that version was gone. She was still operating like everything was normal, like the eye roll was nothing, like I had absorbed it the way I always had and moved on. It took her 3 weeks to realize something was wrong. By then, the silence had already done its work. Claire and I met when we were both 26. She was sharp, confident, the kind of woman who had an opinion about everything and wasn't afraid to say it. I found that attractive. I came from a family where things went unsaid, where tension lived under the surface and nobody addressed it directly. Claire was the opposite of that. She said what she thought. She pushed back. She engaged. At the time, I thought that was strength. And in the beginning, it was. We'd have real conversations, disagreements that actually went somewhere. She challenged me in ways that made me think harder, work harder, pay attention. I liked that she didn't just agree with everything I said. It felt like a real partnership between 2 people who respected each other enough to be honest. We got married after 3 years together. Small wedding, close friends and family, nothing excessive. I was happy that day, in a way that felt solid, not giddy, solid, like I was making a choice I'd thought through and believed in. The first year of marriage was good. Not perfect, but genuinely good. We had the usual friction of 2 people adjusting to shared space and shared decisions. Nothing that felt like a warning sign, just the normal work of building a life together. The shift started somewhere in year 2. It wasn't a single event. That's the thing about this kind of erosion. It doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where you can point and say, that's where it started. It was more like a change in temperature. So gradual you don't register it until one day you realize the room is cold and you can't remember when it stopped being warm. She started correcting me more. Small things at first. The way I told a story. A detail I'd gotten slightly wrong. An opinion she thought was underdeveloped. In private, that was manageable. I could push back, we could discuss it, and usually we'd land somewhere reasonable. But then it started happening in front of people. A comment at brunch with friends about how I'd misremembered something. A correction in front of her colleagues at a work event she'd brought me to. A dismissive laugh when I offered an opinion her sister had asked for directly.
Each time, I told myself it was nothing. She's just honest. She doesn't sugarcoat things. That's who she is. But I started to notice how I felt in the hours after those moments. Smaller, like I'd been weighed and found slightly lacking. And I started to notice something else. I was editing myself before I spoke, running what I was about to say through a filter, asking myself whether it was worth saying out loud or whether it would earn that look. That look. I knew it before the eye roll even had its final form. A slight tightening around her eyes, a small downward pull at one corner of her mouth, the expression of someone tolerating something they find mildly irritating. I was her husband, and I had learned to brace for that expression the way you brace for a small but reliable pain. By the time we were 3 years into the marriage, I had shrunk in ways I hadn't fully mapped yet. I talked less in group settings. I deferred to her on opinions that were actually mine first. I stopped sharing work stories at home because they rarely landed with any warmth. I told myself that was just what long-term relationships looked like. The shine fades, you stop performing for each other. That's normal. I believed that for longer than I should have.
There's a word I didn't learn until I was sitting in a therapist's office much later in this story. Contempt. Not anger, not frustration, not even criticism. Contempt is different. A researcher named John Gottman spent decades studying married couples and found that contempt, the sense that your partner is beneath you, that their thoughts and feelings are not worth serious engagement, is the single strongest predictor of divorce, more than conflict, more than distance, more than any other factor. When I heard that, I didn't feel validated. I felt sick, because I recognized it immediately. That's what Claire had been showing me, not just impatience, contempt. And the hard part is that contempt doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't have to be screaming or name-calling or deliberate cruelty. Sometimes it looks like an eye roll, a sigh at the wrong moment, a smile that says, "I already know where this is going and I'm not impressed." Small signals that accumulate over time into a single clear message: I don't fully respect you. The interruptions got worse in year 3. Not occasional, not accidental, consistent. I would be mid-sentence and she would cut across me, redirect the conversation, finish my thought in a way that was slightly off but delivered with more confidence than I had used. And people would follow her lead because she was engaging and certain, and the room rarely noticed what had just happened. I noticed. I started keeping a kind of internal tally without meaning to. Moments where I'd been talked over, corrected publicly, laughed at lightly in a way that had an edge to it. I wasn't writing any of it down. It was just accumulating in the back of my mind the way these things do. Our friends noticed before I was willing to admit it. My closest friend, Marcus, said something to me about 8 months before the dinner party. We were at a bar, just the two of us, and he brought it up carefully, in the way that good friends do when they know they're stepping onto difficult ground. He said he'd noticed that I seemed quieter lately, that when Claire was around, I didn't really hold the floor the way I used to. He said he didn't know what was going on, but asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I said Claire was just direct, that she had strong opinions, that it wasn't a big deal. I said it quickly, which is usually a sign that a part of you knows you're not being fully honest. Marcus nodded and let it go, but the fact that he'd seen it from the outside without me saying a word about it sat with me for days afterward. My sister picked up on something similar around the same time. She didn't say it directly, she just started checking in more, calling a little more often, asking how things were going at home with a specific kind of care in her voice. I didn't acknowledge what she was really asking. I kept the surface smooth. What I couldn't fully see yet was how much I had restructured my behavior around Claire's reactions. I had stopped suggesting restaurants because she usually had a better idea and said so. I had stopped offering opinions on things that were genuinely my area of knowledge because the correction, when it came, felt worse when I actually knew what I was talking about. I had stopped telling stories that excited me because the return I got wasn't worth the exposure. That's what contempt does when it runs long enough. It doesn't just hurt you in the moments it's expressed, it rewires you between the moments. You start anticipating it,
accommodating it, building your life around its edges without realizing that the life you're building is smaller than the one you're supposed to be living. I was 41 years old, professionally respected, genuinely good at what I did, and in my own home I had learned to make myself smaller so my wife wouldn't look at me like I was wasting her time. I hadn't named that yet. The dinner party would do that for me. The invitation had come 2 weeks earlier. Daniel and Priya hosted dinner a few times a year, always the same core group, 6 to 8 people, good food, the kind of easy conversation that comes from people who have known each other long enough to skip the small talk. I was looking forward to it, genuinely, because the week before I had closed the biggest project of my career, 18 months of work, a structural assessment contract for a mid-sized commercial developer that had grown 3 times larger than the original scope. My firm had been up against 2 larger competitors, and we'd won on the strength of the proposal I'd led. When the final sign-off came through, my senior partner shook my hand and told me it was the best client pitch he'd seen in 15 years at the firm. I don't say that to build myself up. I say it because I want you to understand what I was carrying into that dinner. Something real, something earned, the kind of professional moment that doesn't come often, that you want the people in your life to know about, that you deserve to feel good about for at least a few days before it becomes just the next thing on the list. Claire knew about it. I had told her the night it closed. She said, "That's great," and asked what time I wanted dinner. I let that land and moved on. At Priya's table, the conversation had been going well for about an hour. Work came up naturally the way it does in that group. Someone asked about my firm. Daniel mentioned he'd heard I'd had a good run lately. It was a genuine opening, friendly, the kind of moment where you're invited to share something. So I did. I kept it focused. I explained the scope of the project, why the competition had been real, what our approach had been, why it worked. I was maybe 3 minutes in, engaged, not rambling, reading the table and seeing interest on most faces. That's when I caught the movement to my left. Claire's head turned slightly away from me, and then her eyes went up and around in that long, slow, deliberate arc. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count. The specific quality of it, it wasn't a tired blink or a distracted glance. It was communicative, performed almost. The kind of eye roll that isn't accidental. It's a verdict delivered in public. Priya looked down. I saw it. Daniel held eye contact with me, expression neutral, working hard to give me somewhere to land. Across the table, a woman named Sasha, someone Claire had introduced to the group, glanced at Claire and then back at me with an expression I can only describe as uncomfortable pity. I finished the story. I kept my voice level, my pace steady, my ending clean. I even added a small self-deprecating note at the finish, because that's what you do when you're trying to hold a room together. People responded warmly. Daniel said it sounded like a serious win. Priya refilled my glass. Claire said nothing. She had already moved on to a separate conversation with the person beside her. The table recovered. Conversations branched off. Somebody brought out dessert. On the outside, the night continued without a visible scar. But something had happened in me during those 3 seconds that I cannot fully explain, except to say that a door closed. Not in anger, not in hurt exactly, something quieter than both of those. A kind of clarity that arrives when you finally stop arguing with a truth you've been avoiding. I had spent 2 years making myself smaller so she wouldn't look at me that way. She had looked at me that way anyway, in front of people I respected, while I was talking about something I had earned. I smiled through the rest of that dinner. I thanked Priya for the food, I shook Daniel's hand at the door, I walked to the car, and I didn't say a word. 10:13 a.m. The drive home was 22 minutes. I know that because I've made it dozens of times, and I was aware of every one of those minutes passing. Claire had the radio on low. She made one comment about Sasha's new haircut somewhere around the halfway point. I said something like, "Yeah," and she didn't follow up. That was the full extent of our conversation. She didn't mention what had happened at the table. Not a word. No acknowledgement, no explanation, no reading of the room she had just left.
As far as she was concerned, the evening had been normal, pleasant even. She seemed relaxed in a way that told me she had no idea anything had shifted. That told me something important. It meant she hadn't done it by accident. If she had caught herself, if some part of her had registered the reaction in the room, she would have said something on the drive home. Even Claire, when she knew she'd gone too far, would make some small gesture toward it, a light comment, a half acknowledgement dressed up as a joke. There was nothing, which meant the eye roll hadn't even registered to her as something worth addressing. It was just a reflex, a small, automatic expression of the way she had come to see me. Natural enough that she'd forgotten it by dessert. I sat with that on the drive, and I let it finish settling. Here is what I did not do when we got home. I did not bring it up. I did not sit her down. I did not say, "We need to talk," or walk her through what I had seen on Priya's face, or explain how it had felt to finish that story while she had already mentally left the room. I had done versions of all of those things before over smaller moments. I knew how those conversations went. She would deflect, she would reframe, she would find a way to make the problem about my sensitivity rather than her behavior. And I would end up defending the validity of my own feelings instead of actually being heard. I was tired of that conversation. So I made a different decision. Not out of strategy, not out of a plan to teach her a lesson. It came from somewhere more fundamental than that. I simply decided I was done spending energy trying to get Claire to understand something she had shown me repeatedly she did not want to understand. I would stay, I would be present, I would be civil and functional and decent, but I was done performing for her approval, done over-explaining myself, done filling silence with words designed to get a warmer response, done editing what I said before I said it to manage her reaction. If she wanted to know what I was thinking, she could ask. If she wanted engagement, she could create the conditions for it. I wasn't going to chase it anymore. That decision felt remarkably calm when it arrived. No dramatic internal monologue, no grief, no rage, just a quiet settling. Like something that had been slightly off balance for a long time had finally found its center. I brushed my teeth, I got into bed. Claire was already on her phone beside me. She said goodnight without looking up. I said goodnight. And that was the last night I went to sleep in that marriage trying to figure out what I could do differently. The first 2 weeks were surprisingly easy, not because I was numb or disconnected, but because the decision I'd made had removed a specific kind of exhausting work I hadn't fully realized I was doing every single day. The work of monitoring her mood, calibrating my words, watching for the look, adjusting in real time to manage the temperature of whatever room we were in together. That work was gone, and the absence of it felt like putting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. I went to work, I came home, I cooked twice that week because it was my turn, and I did it without resentment. I asked about her day when it felt natural. I answered her questions directly. I was polite, present, and calm. What I wasn't was open, not in the way I used to be. The version of me that would share something from the day without being asked, that would bring a thought or a frustration or a small win into the kitchen while she was making coffee and just talk, that version had stepped back. Not hidden, just still. Claire didn't notice. That's the part that stays with me from those first 2 weeks. She moved through our shared space exactly as she always had. Same rhythms, same patterns, same low-level distraction when I was talking. Same assumption that I was fine because I wasn't visibly upset. She made a comment on the Thursday of the first week that landed in an interesting way. We were watching something after dinner, and I made an observation about the show. She gave a short laugh, not warm, slightly dismissive, and said, "Okay, sure," and kept watching. Old me would have felt that small sting and either pushed back or
gone quiet in a way that communicated hurt. Instead, I just nodded and returned my attention to the screen. No follow-up, no reaction she could read. She glanced at me a second later, just briefly, then back to the show. I filed that away without making anything of it. On the second weekend, she suggested we go to a farmer's market we'd been to a few times before. I said, sure. We went. I was pleasant company. I asked questions about what she was looking at, responded when she spoke, bought coffee from the same stand we always used, but I didn't volunteer anything, didn't point things out unprompted, didn't fill the natural pauses with conversation the way I normally would have. On the drive back, she said the market had felt different lately. I asked what she meant. She said she wasn't sure, just quieter, maybe. I said it seemed the same to me. She let it go. What she was picking up on wasn't the market. The market was identical.
What was different was me, and she didn't have the framework yet to identify what had changed because nothing on the surface was wrong. I wasn't cold. I wasn't hostile. I wasn't punishing her with visible silence the way people do when they want the other person to ask what's wrong. I was just no longer working to fill the space between us. That space had always been there. I had just been the one papering over it. Week 3 was when it changed. I noticed it first on a Tuesday evening. I was reading in the living room after dinner, something I'd started doing more of lately, and Claire came in and sat down across from me. Not with her phone, not with anything. She just sat. After a minute, she asked what I was reading. I told her. She asked what it was about. I gave her a short, accurate answer. She nodded slowly and stayed sitting there, which was unusual. Normally, if she came into a room, she had a purpose. She'd do something, check something, then leave. Just sitting wasn't her natural mode. I went back to my book. She asked how work was going. I said it was going well. She waited for more. I didn't offer more. There was a pause that lasted long enough to have texture. Then she said, "You've been quiet lately," in a tone that was trying to sound casual but had something underneath it, something that needed a response. I looked up from the book. I told her I hadn't noticed. Then I went back to reading. She left the room about 5 minutes later. The next evening, she tried a different approach. She brought up a story about something that had happened with a colleague, the kind of story she would normally deliver as a one-way report while I listened and responded. But this time, she told it and then paused and looked at me in a way that was clearly an invitation, waiting for me to engage, to ask a follow-up, to do the thing I had always done, which was show interest and pull the conversation forward. I listened. I said, "That sounds frustrating," and I left it there.
She looked at me for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then she finished the story herself and moved on. By the end of that week, she had asked me 3 times in different ways if something was wrong. Each time I told her, calmly and without edge, that nothing was wrong. Because technically that was true. Nothing was newly wrong. The wrong thing had been in place for 2 years. The difference was I had stopped pretending otherwise. On Friday, she tried affection. She came up behind me while I was at the kitchen counter and put her hand on my back and rested her chin on my shoulder in a way that used to be a reliable move. It was warm, deliberate, designed to close distance. I didn't pull away. I didn't tense. I turned my head slightly and gave her a small, genuine smile. Then I went back to what I was doing. She stayed there for a moment, as if waiting for something more. When it didn't come, she stepped back. That was the moment I think her discomfort became real anxiety, because she was used to being able to reach me, used to knowing that a certain kind of warmth would produce a certain kind of response, that she had reliable access to my emotional register whenever she decided to use it. That access had always been there, consistent and available, regardless of how she had treated me earlier that day or that week. And now the door was there, but opening it no longer guaranteed anything was waiting on the other side.
She didn't have a name for what was happening, but her nervous system knew something had changed, and by that weekend she was watching me in a way she never had before. Not with guilt yet, with uncertainty. That was new. She brought it up on a Sunday morning. We were in the kitchen, coffee made, no particular plans, the kind of slow morning that used to be easy between us. She sat down across from me at the table, and I could tell from the way she positioned herself that this wasn't casual. She had decided to have this conversation.
She said she felt like I was pulling away from her. I put my mug down. I looked at her directly. I told her I wasn't pulling away. I told her I had just stopped doing something I should have stopped doing a long time ago. She asked what that meant, so I told her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for drama or build a case designed to devastate her. I just described what had happened at Priya's dinner table with the same factual clarity I would use to explain anything else. I told her what I had seen. I told her what the room had looked like in that moment. I told her about Priya looking down and Daniel holding his expression careful and Sasha's face across the table. She started to say something. I held up one hand. Not aggressively, just a signal that I wasn't finished. Then I told her about the drive home. How she had talked about Sasha's haircut and gone to bed like nothing had happened. How that told me more than the eye roll itself had. Then I went further back. I told her about the interruptions, the corrections in front of other people, the dismissive laugh at her sister's dinner when her sister had asked for my opinion, the comment at the work event, the "okay, sure" on the couch. I didn't list them to punish her. I listed them because she needed to understand that I wasn't talking about one bad moment. I was talking about a pattern I had absorbed for 2 years while telling myself it wasn't that serious. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Her first response was to tell me I was being oversensitive, that she didn't remember half of those moments I was describing, that I had always been prone to taking things too personally. I had expected this. I let it sit without reacting. She pushed a little harder then, said that if something had been bothering me for 2 years, it was my fault for not saying anything sooner, that she couldn't fix something she didn't know was a problem. I told her that was fair and that I was telling her now.
That took the wind out of the argument she was building. She had nowhere to go with it if I was agreeing with part of what she said instead of defending myself. There was a long pause. She looked at her coffee. Something in her posture changed. The defensive architecture she'd assembled in the first 2 minutes started to lose its shape. Then she said, quietly, that she hadn't realized how often she did it. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't an accounting of everything I'd described. But it was the first sentence she'd said in that conversation that had the sound of something real in it. Not managed, not strategic, just a small, honest acknowledgement that arrived after everything else had failed. I nodded. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it, but I also told her that hearing it wasn't enough, that something had changed in me over the past few weeks that wasn't going to reverse itself because of one honest sentence on a Sunday morning, that I needed to see whether the acknowledgement meant anything beyond this conversation. She looked at me then in a way I hadn't seen before, not the tolerating expression, not defensive, something closer to recognition, like she was seeing, maybe for the first time, that there was a version of this that didn't end with me still here. The days after that conversation were uneven. Claire moved through them in a way I recognized from other difficult moments in our marriage. Not linear, not clean. She didn't arrive at a consistent place and stay there. She cycled. The first 2 days she was softer, more careful with her words, more attentive, making small gestures that were clearly intentional. She asked about my work in a way that had genuine interest in it. She listened when I answered without redirecting. It was noticeable enough that I registered it and gave it room. But by day 3, something shifted in her. I came home from work and the warmth had contracted. She was civil but cooler,
And at one point when I was talking about something that had happened that afternoon, I caught the beginning of that familiar expression, the slight tightening, the pull at the corner of her mouth, before she caught herself and smoothed it. She had almost done it again. And she knew I had seen her almost do it. Neither of us said anything about it. That moment told me something important. The pattern wasn't going to dissolve because she'd acknowledged it once. It was built into her reflexes at a level that a single honest conversation wasn't going to reach. Real change, if it was coming, would take longer and require more than good intentions during a difficult week. I made an appointment with a therapist 4 days after the Sunday conversation. Not couples therapy, individual therapy. I needed someone outside of everything to help me see clearly, because I was aware that I had my own blind spots in this. I had let the pattern run for 2 years without naming it. I had shrunk without fully understanding I was shrinking. That wasn't all Claire. Some of that was me, and I wanted to understand my part honestly before deciding anything. The therapist's name was Robert. First session, he let me talk. Second session, he asked me one question that stopped me cold. He asked whether I had ever told Claire directly and specifically what I needed from her before the silence, before the dinner party, before things had reached the point they'd reached. I sat with that for a long time. The answer was no, not really. I had reacted to individual moments. I had pulled back, gone quiet, shown hurt in ways I expected her to read. But I had never sat across from her and said, clearly and without ambiguity, this specific behavior is damaging how I see our marriage. Robert didn't tell me what to do with that. He just left it on the table.
I left that session feeling the particular discomfort of someone who has been holding a clean narrative and just found a complication in it. I had been treated poorly. That was real. But I had also been passive in a way that had let it continue. Both things were true. Claire, meanwhile, was becoming harder to read at home. Some evenings she was clearly trying. Other evenings she seemed to be waiting for something from me. Reassurance maybe, or some signal that we were okay. And when it didn't come, she would get quiet in a way that had an edge to it. Once, she said, with a frustration she didn't fully hide, that she felt like she was being punished. I told her I understood why it felt that way. I told her I wasn't punishing her. I told her the difference between punishment and consequence was that punishment was designed to make someone suffer, and consequence was just what happened when a pattern ran long enough to change something real. She didn't respond to that right away, but she didn't dismiss it either. 10:17 a.m. I gave it another week before I said what needed to be said, not to extend her discomfort, not to build toward a dramatic finish. I wanted to be sure that what I was about to say was coming from clarity and not from any residue of hurt or anger that would make me say it wrong. When I was sure, I sat down with her on a Wednesday evening. Same kitchen table, same 2 mugs of coffee. I had not rehearsed a speech. I had just thought carefully about what was true and what I needed her to hear. I told her that I loved her. I meant that. Whatever had happened in the last 2 years, whatever had eroded between us, I had not arrived at indifference. I was still there. That mattered to me to say first because what came next wasn't about ending things. It was about deciding whether there was anything left worth building. Then I told her the truth. I told her that one conversation and one difficult week were not enough, that I had watched her cycle through warmth and withdrawal and frustration over the past 10 days, and what I had seen told me the pattern was deeper than she had acknowledged on that Sunday morning, that I had been to see a therapist, and that in doing so I had recognized my own failure to address this directly before it reached the point it had. I owned that. I told her I should have said this plainly 2 years ago instead of shrinking and hoping she would notice. But I also told her that acknowledgement only mattered if it changed something going forward. So I gave her 2 options, not ultimatums dressed up in diplomatic language, actual options, both of them real. The first was couples therapy, consistent, committed, with a willingness on her part to examine the contempt pattern specifically and what was driving it, not as a gesture, not as something to get through so we could go back to normal, as a genuine attempt to rebuild the foundation of how we treated each other. The second was separation, not with anger, not with blame assigned entirely to her, but an honest recognition that if she wasn't willing or able to do the first, then we had likely reached the end of what this marriage could be. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me if I had already made up my mind. I told her no, and that was the truce. I was not sitting across from her hoping she would choose separation so I could feel justified. I was sitting across from her genuinely uncertain, genuinely willing, and genuinely done with the version of the marriage we'd been living in. She looked at the table, then at me. She said she didn't want to lose this. I told her that was not the same as being willing to change, and I needed to know which one she meant. She started to cry then, not performed, not managed, something that had been compressed for a long time, finding a way out. She said she knew she had done it.
She said she didn't fully understand why, but she knew it had been real, and she knew it had been wrong. That was the most honest she had been with me in 2 years. We started couples therapy the following week. I won't tell you it was clean from there. It wasn't. There were sessions that were hard in ways the previous 2 years hadn't been, because we were finally in a room where nothing could be deflected. There were moments I had to look at parts of myself I hadn't wanted to see. There were moments she had to do the same. But something was different now. The silence that had made her nervous had done something the arguments never managed to do. It had made the invisible visible. It had shown both of us clearly what happened when I stopped carrying more than my share of the weight. I had not set out to teach her a lesson. I had simply stopped pretending the lesson wasn't necessary. And for the first time in a long time, we were both in the same room, looking at the same truth, deciding together what to do with it. That's not a happy ending. It's something more durable than that. It's a real one.